It's an honor and a pleasure to be speaking here at the Brent Scowcroft Legacy Conference and in front of the President and First Lady. And I'd like to thank Ambassador Crocker, thank Scowcroft Director Andrew Neitsias, Assistant Director Don Bailey, and the others who made this possible. Most importantly, I'd like to thank Brent Scowcroft for giving generously of his time for my dozens of interviews with him over the 5 years or so we talked on an almost monthly basis so as to be able to write his biography. I'm also grateful to several people here who are willing to talk to me about the general or about the events of which they were part. I thank them for their gift of time and commitment to this project. I should also note that I'm very appreciative of the assistance of the archivists, photo librarians, and technicians at the Bush Presidential Library. And I especially want to recognize Dr. Michael Desch, who in late 2006, I believe it was, vouched for me when Scowcroft first learned of my interest in writing his biography and asked Professor Desch, "Who is the Sparrow Fellow?" What I'd like to do this morning is to talk about Brent Scowcroft's background, his career, and the qualities that have made him so remarkably effective. And these are more personal qualities than the national security qualities, although there's some overlap that you heard from Stephen Hadley. So in other words, what made him so remarkably effective, and I think it's fair to say, so respected and indeed so loved. One of his favorite jokes for starting public addresses is the following: "A friend in Washington is someone who stabs you in the chest." The irony, though, is that Scowcroft does not lack for a wide network of friends. He has a great many admirers and close friends in Washington, around the United States, and indeed around the world. Brent Scowcroft, let's see, this is a, oops. Okay, let's see. I have my clicker if that works.
Yep.
Okay, here. May just be a battery thing. The plug-in thing is right here. I just give it to you.
No.
A little. Shouldn't bother you. No. The little.
Pictures?
Sorry about this. This is technology. We should. Okay.
I thought we did.
This one working? Maybe it's the wrong one.
Push
Yes,
down,
sir.
push down,
Push down. Okay.
push down.
All right, thanks for your patience. Brent Scowcroft, no middle initial, grew up in Ogden, Utah, in an unusually secure and a nurturing environment. Two of his great-grandfathers were Mormon captains leading companies of Latter-day Saints on foot from Omaha to the Great Salt Lake Basin. One of them was Job Pingree, a successful merchant, a prosperous banker, and co-founder of the Pingree National Bank, and also a large landowner and one of Ogden's first residents. Another was Richard Ballantyne, one of the Latter-day Saints' 70, a man of great faith and many talents, and founder of the Mormon Sunday school system. A third was John Scowcroft, who came to America at the age of 36, established a confectionery in Ogden, which soon grew into a very successful dry goods wholesaler. Scowcroft and Sons eventually became the largest such wholesaler situated between the Mississippi and the West Coast. He built a grand home he called Lancaster, one that was designed by the same architect who designed Ogden City Hall, the Utah Loan and Trust Building, and Ogden's finest hotel at the time. Scowcroft and Sons' best-known product was Never Rip overalls, which in 1909 the company produced at a rate of 2,000 pairs a day. By 1914, the company had 250 employees alone making overalls, work pants, and shirts. You see also that it was a progressive company. The sign, I'm not sure if you can read it, but it says 8 hours a day and only 44 hours a week. And so this is quite progressive for a company in 1919. I go over this history because it suggests just how secure Scowcroft was socially, culturally, and materially. He grew up in a protective, nurturing environment. His parents were married in the Mormon temple, and he was born 10 years later in 1925, 40 years and 7 years younger than his two sisters who doted on him. Reflecting on growing up in Ogden, Scowcroft rightly observed that his idyllic childhood gave him a highly distorted view of fellow humans. Not once do you remember hearing his parents fight or remember feeling any tension at home. He had a happy childhood by all accounts, was in the Boy Scouts, the Polk, Drum, and Bugle Corps, as you see, and enjoyed roaming around the Wasatch foothills only blocks from his home. Upon reading West Point Today, in 1937, the same year the book was published, he decided he wanted to go to West Point. Yet his protected insular world of the Intermountain West was, as that of many others at the time, probably most Americans, was turned topsy-turvy by the attack on Pearl Harbor, which he remembers listening to on the radio at home with his parents. After first attending a West Point prep program in Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, where he overlapped with future senators Frank Church and Henry Kissinger, of course, Kissinger not being a senator, who were both with the Army Specialized Training Corps. In 1944, he started at the U.S. Military Academy as part of the World War II cohort that was to have a 3-year curriculum because of the rush to graduate new Air Force, Army Air Corps, and Army officers. Upon finishing in the top third of his class, he joined the Army Air Corps. After training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio and Chandler Air Force Base in Arizona, just outside Phoenix, incidentally, they had to get up at 4 a.m. to fly so as to survive the desert heat. He joined the Strategic Air Command as a fighter escort pilot. A few months later, in January 1949, while on dogfight training exercise over central New Hampshire, he, as the Manchester Union leader reported, miraculously escapes death. The engine of his F-51 Mustang failed at 2,000 feet, and he couldn't use a parachute for reasons of time and altitude, sufficient time to bail out, and so tried to crash land the plane, which he did after tearing loose some telephone cables, hitting a stone bridge, and missing a passenger bus by about 100 yards. His plane could have easily caught fire and exploded, and he could have easily been paralyzed, if not killed. As it was, he had 2 broken vertebrae and would spend the next 2 years in military hospitals. Confined to a plaster cast from the waist up, it was a difficult period. Not only was he told that he would no longer be able to fly again, but barely a month after the crash, he learned his father died. The two were very close, and Scowcroft had always assumed that he would later join his father in the family business after being in the military for a few years. Now the family business had less appeal. And in lying in the hospital beds, he realized he wanted to study national security and be involved in setting national security policy. Brent's mother, Lucille Scowcroft, was unbelievably devastated by her husband's death, and she never recovered from the loss and remained depressed for the rest of her life. There was some good news. It was while being cared for at Valley Forge Hospital, the largest U.S. military hospital at the time, that Scowcroft met a pretty, young, outgoing, and vivacious Army Air Corps nurse, First Lieutenant Marion Horner, known as Jackie to her friends, who couldn't resist the play on the nursery rhyme. Because of Marion Horner's immense competence, positive attitude, strong work ethic, and personal qualities, she had just been awarded the Outstanding Nurse at Valley Forge Army Hospital. She was also Roman Catholic, a Pennsylvanian, and 2 years older than Brent. They would marry in September 1951 in a small ceremony in Sumter, South Carolina, where Jackie was stationed, after he'd finally recovered and was flying out of Mather Air Force Base in California. It was also at Valley Forge Hospital that Scowcroft received a letter from Colonel Herman Bukema, the head of the Department of Social Sciences at West Point, inviting him to return and teach. Scowcroft spent 18 months at Columbia University, where he studied public law and government and earned a master's degree, and then taught for 4 years at West Point. This was followed by a billet in air intelligence in Belgrade, where he overlapped with the ambassador George Kennan, teaching in and then chairing at the new Air Force Academy Political Science Department in Colorado Springs, and doing postgraduate work at the Joint Forces Staff College and later the National War College. Throughout, he impressed his superior officers. He was, quote, exceptionally hardworking and bright, they wrote in their efficiency reports. And these were the days before when officers could see their ratings. He showed a maturity of thought and grasp of academic problems uncommon in officers of his grade and service. He performed his duties with outstanding understanding, intelligence, skill, and judgment, and he had an iron will. They consistently remarked on Scowcroft's inquisitive intelligence, obvious brilliance, and uncommon ability to grow in stature as his responsibilities increased. None of Scowcroft's supervising officers, among the most senior officers in the Air Force once he became colonel, could determine a ceiling on Scowcroft's ability to take on additional responsibilities. For his exceptional performances in the Pentagon, Scowcroft received the Air Force Distinguished Service Medal, which cited his penetrating analyses and consistently sound judgment and advice on matters developed for consideration of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dealing with the most significant aspects of our military posture and national strategic policy. In March 71, he received an award for his important and loyal service in the position of responsibility and support of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in December 1971, the Air Force awarded him the Legion of Merit. Lieutenant Colonel Brent Scowcroft, the citation read, distinguished himself by exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service in the United States. His exemplary ability, diligence, and devotion to duty were instrumental factors in the resolution of many complex problems of major importance to the Air Force. This was actually in reference to his management of the Air Force's Vietnamization component. The fact that Scowcroft became White House military assistant and subsequently Kissinger's deputy national security advisor were no accidents. Air Force leaders knew that Lieutenant General Alexander Haig, Kissinger's then deputy, wanted to return to the Army, and General James Hughes, who Scowcroft was to replace as military assistant, calculated that Scowcroft had the intelligence, academic background, administrative savvy, and personality to attract Kissinger's attention. And since the Deputy National Security Advisor was the first to brief the President each morning and was in constant contact with the President as Commander-in-Chief, General Hughes and the Air Force Vice Chiefs of Staff, General John Vogt, wanted an Air Force officer as Kissinger's right-hand man. Like other Air Force and other military leaders, they both feared and distrusted Kissinger because of the National Security Advisor's unpredictable foreign policy and apparent influence over the President. They, along with other Air Force leaders, especially disliked having the National Security Advisor tell them how many and what kind of missiles and bombers they could have. But with Scowcroft as Deputy National Security Advisor, he would be presumably well placed to inform them of developments vital to Air Force interests, such as diplomatic breakthroughs or early drafts of the federal budget. Scowcroft did shine as a military assistant, informed, competent, judicious, caring, solicitous, and his Air Force superiors were proven right. Kissinger did select him to replace Haig. And once Nixon appointed Kissinger as Secretary of State in September 1973, Scowcroft became de facto National Security Advisor, a position he continued to have under President Ford until appointed National Security Advisor outright in November 1975. He was involved with Cold War and SALT talks, with military arms sales, with U.S.-Iran ties, the U.S. role in the resupply of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, and the handling of intelligence scandals of the mid-'70s. He was particularly involved with the evacuation of South Vietnam in April 1975, which he administered, in effect, with help of Colonel Robert McFarland. They monitored how many Americans and Vietnamese were taken out each day, using figures from the Saigon Embassy and Department of Defense and calculated how many remained and how many had to be evacuated. They coordinated actions with the State Department and the Pacific Command, and mostly they simply tried to impose some order and to ensure a modicum of cohesion on what Scowcroft called a confusing, crazy mess. In fact, 130,000 Vietnamese were able to get out in April 1975, 10 times the number planned for by the State Department. In the final 14 hours alone, on April 29th and 30th, Marine helicopters completing hundreds of shuttles between the embassy and other locations around Saigon and the U.S. fleet lifted out almost 8,000 U.S. military personnel, embassy officials, South Vietnamese, and their dependents. The Vietnamese had their own name for the evacuation, the running. Notwithstanding the grim conclusion to the Vietnam War, two close observers of the Ford White House say it was Scowcroft's handling of the evacuation of Saigon and South Vietnam that led the president to appoint Scowcroft to succeed Kissinger in the Halloween massacre November 2nd, when he replaced many of his cabinet. Scowcroft also essentially managed the Mayaguez crisis, which Ford's chief political advisor, Robert Hartman, called the first real test of his leadership. Could Ford be decisive in the crisis, given his job approval rating of 39%? Could he save the ship's crew, in contrast to the USS Pueblo, where the crew was held for a year and a half and used as propaganda tools of the North Koreans? Could he work under the newly imposed War Powers Act and still act presidentially? Again, Scowcroft was up all hours, stayed on top of the details, and coordinated the U.S. government's response, such that the 3.5 days of the Mayaguez crisis came to a successful end. Interestingly, because it happened so quickly, the operation had no code name like Frequent Wind, which was the code name for the evacuation of Saigon, or Eagle Pole, the military evacuation by air of Phnom Penh. What enabled Scowcroft to so impress his supervising officers? What were the qualities that made him so effective as Deputy National Security Advisor, head of the eponymous Scowcroft Commission, the President's Commission on Strategic Forces under Ronald Reagan, and one of the 3 members of the Tower Commission, as you've just heard, and then National Security Advisor under President George Bush? Several traits stand out to me. One is his dedication to public service, whether the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force, the Department of Defense, the White House, or the United States. He's extraordinarily serious and dedicated. A very hard worker who in his spare time, Bob Gates told me, likes nothing better than to do and to talk about national security. So Scowcroft sometimes had an irritating edge to his voice, as General Colin Powell wrote in his memoirs. No one held it against him because they knew that Scowcroft walked the talk. As President Bush once put it, Scowcroft didn't want anything. He once told me that as Scowcroft, there was never a reason to be selfish, although when pressed, he conceded that possibly illness demanded some self-attention. Still, it speaks volumes of his character. As part of this loyalty and dedication to public service, he looked at the big picture. So he was creative, resourceful, even entrepreneurial in his dealings with the military bureaucracy in pursuit of his objectives and those of his superior officers. With his cheerful and straightforward demeanor, his quiet leadership, and the force of his own example, he was able to disarm or deflect almost all potential personal clashes or bureaucratic conflicts. Relatedly, he has an exceptional ability to divorce his own ego from his professional performance when decisions didn't go his own way. He accepted the decisions that were handed down, irrespective of his former positions on the issues. So when his superior officers or the president decided on a course of action, Scowcroft could be counted on carrying it out. He didn't question or challenge the decisions. He didn't grouse or grumble. He did not attempt to maneuver around them by going over the heads of his bosses or by leaking his opposition to the press. Nor did he passively resist his superiors' decisions by delaying implementation or ignoring them, both tactics officials use to avoid taking actions that run contrary to their own preferences. These qualities caused Scowcroft's colleagues, bosses, peers, and subordinates alike to see him as both a quintessential team player and as an independent-minded officer of impeccable integrity. They recognized he was acting on behalf of the Air Force, the Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs, or the President, whatever the case may be, and not trying to enhance his own reputation or feather his own nest. He often succeeded by appealing to his colleagues' better angels. He is an intellectual, too. He's curious about the Cold War and international communism, interested in Russian and Soviet history, which is why being assistant air attaché in Yugoslavia appealed to him, and being able to complete his PhD at Columbia. And as a student of strategic weapons, he published a paper on deterrence and strategic superiority, which he wrote as a student at the National War College, and became very close to one of the Air Force's foremost minds, Major General Richard Yudkin, who has been described as the intellectual master of a new generation of Air Force staff officers expert in nuclear warfare. He had other important teachers and mentors, too. I mentioned Herman Buchema, George Lincoln, and Andrew Goodpaster. Deriving from his emotional security and perhaps his near-death experience, he is once poised and calm under fire in crisis situations. He is able to look ahead, beyond the near-term hiccups and hand-wringing. Another way of thinking about this is that he exhibits a rare multivocality, one who can speak to and therefore span many audiences. These are qualities perhaps found more commonly among presidents and leading politicians. One of his voices, if you will, was his experience as a diplomat and international relations and policy practitioner. So he's a strategist, as I've described, with a small s, not like his national security advisor and a former teacher and colleague of mine, Walt Rostow, who wrote Stages of Economic Growth, much less a Clausewitz or Sun Tzu. But he does think long terms, looks at the pieces in play, and thanks to his knowledge of world history and international relations, he's able to calculate and get a good sense of how these forces are at work in the world as he sees it. This is where I believe in the importance of history, Scowcroft says. The study of history taught him how countries behave and helped him to remain objective about people, events, institutions, and forces, their origins, their likely interactions, and the possible future results. In this vein, he wrote articles, book chapters, books, commission reports, and about 100 op-eds, either solo or co-authored, about national security policy broadly defined. As a result, he's been able to reach academics, specialized journalists, policy experts, and members of the public, most recently with the Ukrainian situation and the Iran nuclear deal. Another voice of his was that of an experienced policymaker and former staff officer who knew the Pentagon, how Washington worked, how to get others' buy-in so they cooperate and implement the White House's plans, and you heard of a little bit of this already. This is to say that as a policy and a strategy maker, if you don't have access to the levers of power and the ability to wield them skillfully, then you're just an armchair theorist. A military analyst cannot be a strategist if his plans do not get implemented by the forces on the ground, at sea, or in the air. Likewise, a campaign consultant is no electoral strategist if she does not control where her candidate gives her speeches and spends her funds. We think of George Kennan as a great strategist because of his 1946 long telegram and 1947 Foreign Affairs article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, which in large part provided the conceptual underpinnings for the U.S.-Soviet Cold War policy. By contrast, the decades Kennan spent writing at the Center for Advanced Study and on his Pennsylvania farm, when U.S. policymakers all but ignored his analyses and prescriptions, are of interest to intellectual historians, and they may be significant, but they do nothing for his resume as a strategist. Similarly, Henry Kissinger is famous and controversial for his and President Nixon's strategic vision with detente, SALT, the ending of the Vietnam War, the opening into China, and as well as for the private advice he has given Bush 41, Bush 43, and other U.S. presidents, but not for the quality and volume of his analyses of foreign policy he has published in his many books and writings. Yet another audience of his, another one of his voices, has been with the intelligence community. Scowcroft was trained in intelligence and as national security advisor was an important consumer of intelligence, as well as an overseer and commissioner of covert actions. He was crucial to the White House response to the intelligence scandals of the mid-'70s, and in mid-2001, both before and after 9/11, he served as the head of an external review board to reform intelligence. There is his military expertise, too, on weapons and nuclear deterrence, heading of the Scowcroft Commission on Strategic Forces, and the central roles he played in leading the Bush administration to START and to START II. He's on this,